Good morning. Good to see everybody this morning. Everybody have a good week? No? There is at the Lockhart house a new garage. Just want you to know. I've seen pictures. It's miniature. It sits in the house. It's Hot Wheels power. Bo was playing with it. So it was cute. Bo's been sick. Yeah. Who else been sick? I know. Let's see. Stephanie is kind of getting over the COVID. Adam really has never been tested, but he's been puny all week long. Anissa now has COVID. Christy was tested Friday, I think. She's negative for COVID, but they're not feeling well. So remember them. Anybody else? I haven't. Did anybody check on Charles and Nancy? I didn't check on them this week. They're not here again today. All right, so we need to do that. Minnie and Buck, yeah, they haven't been here in 2 weeks either, so we need to check on them. And kind of at the 1 week, 1 week of retirement. That's right. That's right. That's why Jim, you and I are still working, right? That's good. Yep. Exactly. Another week, and then it's over. Scrub fuse. Well, I tell you what. Oh man, yeah. Remember those folks that we did mention because being at the end of the year, I kind of gave them a little slack because people get and have parties, family gatherings, so forth and so on. Do want to remember the Drakes and the Buchanans this week. We are in the midst of a study of death, and as I've said, pretty much the introduction of all the lessons. This is not. It's not one of those in many ways pleasant subjects, but it is one of those that is probably the most intriguing. And the more questions we seemingly answer, the more questions we bring up. And we probably have more questions than we really have answers. Well, why? Well, as I've said in the introduction, Deuteronomy 29:29. Secret things belong to God. And God didn't reveal everything to us, but yet we have those questions, and that's just part of human nature. You know, what is beyond? How are we going to be? And why God didn't answer all those things, don't know. Maybe, you can just throw out possibilities. Maybe it was the fact that God wanted us to be inquisitive enough to just say, okay, let's study the Word of God a little bit more along that angle. Maybe it's the fact that we wouldn't really understand all of it because we're talking about a spiritual realm versus a physical realm. Maybe it's due to the fact that really wasn't the point of the revelation that he gave to us. The point of the revelation that he gave to us was really, if you look at the Bible, the point of the Bible is to reveal God. And to reveal God and his way to us. And the afterlife is really not part of that, so to speak. Yes, we're going to get there. But that was not the purpose for God revealing what he did through his word. So whatever the possibilities, whatever the reason, we don't know. When we get down to, say, this lesson and next lesson, I've got 3 lessons, but one of them is more just a positive lesson, if you can be a positive lesson on death. But this lesson and next week are really questions that I've been asked through the years of people and things from the Bible. And I will say this, that the things that I'm going to present today with regards to the 2 questions that we'll look at today, and I'm going to have to, in order to look at both, we'll have to kind of move quickly. But I want us to understand that there's going to be a lot of inferring. And so we're going to answer the questions, especially when you get to the second one, will we recognize one another in the afterlife? You have to infer a lot of things, and that's tricky. And I've answered it in such a way that we're going to look at both sides, but yes, with a slant, and really the way I think that the answer is. That is to say, if you disagree with me, that's fine. Because in inference, in inferring, we can always infer the wrong thing. And so we have to be careful. We have to be careful with context. We have to be careful with immediate context and greater context. We've talked about that, I think, last week or week before. We talked about difference in context. You have to look at things within the context, and you have to understand and ask yourself, is this really what God's revealing? And so inference is always important and yet scary. It's sort of like I shared, I'm pretty sure, this story with you about a little lady that could not read. And so she got a letter. This is years ago. She got a letter from her son who was in the military. And when the postman brought it and she looked at it, she immediately handed it to him and asked him if he would read it to her before he went on his way. Well, he was busy and he was behind schedule and he had somewhere to be when he was off work and he had to get off work and all. He was busy. And so he read it to her, but when he read it in a very hateful tone. He was very upset that she had asked him to do this, but he was willing to do it anyway. And so as she heard the letter, she was very upset. She was very mad, her son. And a few hours transpired, and one of her neighbors came over, and they were sitting talking, and the lady said, "Do you mind reading this letter from my son to me?" And so the lady said no, and she read it in a very nice, gentle tone, very relaxed atmosphere. And same letter, and the lady, when she got through, the mother said, "Well, bless his heart, isn't he the sweetest thing you've ever?" She was mad at him, and yet she wasn't. So sometimes when we read things, and we have to be careful not to read things into the text. But we also have to let the text speak for itself. But sometimes there are things there that maybe don't strike us one way, but do strike us another. So we'll see these things as we look at them. The first question we want to look at today, that is not the first question, but the first question of the day is, do the dead know what is happening here on earth? Do the dead see what's going on here on earth? That's always a question that's asked. And some would even go as far as to say when one passes away, that they can even interfere in the events of what is taking place here on earth. Now, let's answer it this way. Is it a possibility? Possibly. If we allow for God to use those individuals. You see, never say God can't use and won't use individuals. It is to say, however, that I don't think the Bible teaches us that the dead really know or understand what is taking place here upon the earth. Let's look in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 9, if you don't mind. Ecclesiastes chapter 9. We're going to look in verses 5 and 6. We're actually going to jump back to verse 4. And this bridges what has been said, and so I'll just ask you to read the first 3 verses sometime. But it bridges what has been said to what is said now. But for him who is joined to all the living, there is hope. For a living dog is better than a dead lion. For the living know that they'll die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten. Also their love, their hatred, their envy have now perished. Nevermore will they have a share in anything done under the sun. when he talks about, and we have to look at and we have to be honest, a couple of things. We have to be honest that as we studied Ecclesiastes back some time ago this past year, we talked about the attitude which Solomon had, and that he's coming to the conclusion, he's seeing things. And so we have to be very careful when we come to the book of Ecclesiastes. Don't just take one verse and say, that's what God says. Because, like I say, it's the attitude, it's the philosophy that Solomon had, and it's really his progression of thought as he searches for happiness and meaning in life. His progression in thought ultimately till he gets to well, all of the world is vanity and God's what's important, chapters 11 and chapters 12. But he makes a couple of statements here. He talks about, for the memory of them is forgotten. You have to say, well, is he talking about the memory of the individual, or is he talking about the memory that individuals have of him? And that's what you have to look at, and you have to decide on with regards to that issue. We've come to the conclusion, or some of us did, I did at least, in teaching the class, that when we die, we are conscious. We've already kind of answered a couple of these questions. When we die, we are conscious. When we die, we evidently have memory. We looked at the story of the rich man and Lazarus last week in Luke 16. Having said that, then, we'd have to say, well, if you put that in context with this, then probably he's talking about the memory that others have. We soon forget about them. We soon forget about who they are. But then he goes on in verse 6, and he talks about how the dead, they don't have a share in anything done under the sun. The last two lines, if you will, of verse 6. If you go back and trace out, and one of the things, let me back up. When you begin to study the Bible, we talked about last week, we talked about immediate context, and we talked about greater context. One of the things that's important in trying to figure out the understanding of what the writer is saying is, and that's helpful, is to look at how the writer uses that phraseology. You know, I think Wednesday night I shared with those in Wednesday night class, just for my own personal study. I've been studying out of the book of Romans for the last couple of weeks, and how Paul uses the word righteousness and justice in that book. It's not different than how he uses it in other places, but you get a sense of what he was trying to teach the church at Rome by really looking at just the word itself in the verses and within the context of just that book. Well, Solomon uses this phrase, under the sun. He uses it quite a few times. I've given you a short little list, an abbreviated list, chapter 1, verses 3, 9, 14, chapter 2, 22, 17, 19, 20, 22, etc. There's a whole long list, and you can get a concordance either online or a book concordance and check it out. But every time he uses that phrase, under the sun, he's talking about on the earth. And so by virtue of that, what Solomon is saying in this passage is that those that have passed on, they don't have a share, they don't have a part in what's going on here in this world. They don't understand this world, this life at this time. They have passed. Well, let's add another verse to that text, and then we'll kind of bring this question to a close, and you can participate as well. And that's book of 1 Samuel chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 39. One of the things we have to be very conscious of, and one of the things that I have in answering this question through the years from individuals, is that if you appeal to the Ecclesiastes chapter 9 passage, we come away with an understanding of, well, then do we really know anything? That's not the answer that I get from Ecclesiastes 9, nor from the rest of the Bible. The answer that I get is we do know, but as far as what's going on, I'll just use personal example, if you don't mind. My father passed away in 2006. Mother passed away in 2020. I don't believe that they know what's going on in my life and in mine and Suzanne's life. I don't think that they know what's going on here upon earth. That's not to say that they don't have consciousness, they don't have memory, they don't understand where they are and have recognition and things of that nature. It's just to say that they're only involved here. I think if you look under part C or part 3, excuse me, on this, here's the answer that I use most often. And that is that I am aware, I am conscious, I know what's going on in this room at this time. You do too. You know what I'm saying. You know what people that you can see are doing. You know who's here. You're very aware of all those things. But do you know who's driving down the street right now? Do you know what color car is passing this building? Do you know what color or what make of vehicle that is? Do you know what the neighbors are doing right over here? Do you know what the dog's doing down the street? No. You still have consciousness, you still have awareness, but it is where you are, and it is not somewhere else. And so that's the answer. I'd ask you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 20. Let's go back to verse 35. So it was in the morning that Jonathan went out into the field with David, and the little lad was with him. And he said to his lad, "Now run, find the arrows which I shoot." As the lad ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the lad had come to the place where the arrow which Jonathan had shot, Jonathan cried, but out after the lad and said, "Is not the arrow beyond you?" And Jonathan cried out after the lad, "Make haste, hurry, do not delay." So Jonathan's lad gathered up the arrows and came back to his master. But the lad did not know anything, only Jonathan and David knew of the matter. Then Jonathan gave his weapon to his lad and said to him, "Go, carry them to the city." Now, you may remember this story. It's the story of when basically David and Jonathan have, and I'm going to do an abbreviated version of the story. They've come to the understanding of Jonathan warning David that he needs to flee. Saul, as his father, is after him, and so they use the idea of the arrow, and the young man shooting the arrow, and where did you go get the arrow? Where did it land? If it goes beyond David, you're supposed to flee. If it's short, no, or if he finds it, then lo and behold, you can stay. But notice that the young man was aware. Notice the young man was active. Notice the young man was doing something, but he didn't know the message that was being revealed. Folks that use this verse to answer this question a lot of times use this verse to just simply say there's communication, there's understanding, there's recognition because of all the things we've already talked about in this series. So when you die, it's not that you're finished, complete, done, nothing. It is to say that there is awareness, but only where you are. And only with what you understand. So that's kind of really the Ecclesiastes passage is really the one that's used to answer this question. Do the dead know what's happening here on earth? They know what's happening, but not necessarily here upon the earth, according to Ecclesiastes 9. Anything anybody wants to say or add? Sure. No, I couldn't last week, so go ahead. Yeah, in 1 Samuel 20, not 20, 28. Yeah. No, other than the witch at Endor, that whole incantation, I can't. I want to teach that pretty soon for the book of 1 Samuel and get into that, but I can't answer that. I don't have an answer for that one. Yeah. 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 I think the definitive answer to the question that's posed in this series of lessons that we just posed is to understand that even individuals, if they have an awareness of what's going on, I use mom and dad, if mom and dad have an awareness of what's going on, have an awareness of well, Graceland, neither one of them would have known Graceland, have an awareness of Graceland, that they can't influence what is taking place here upon the earth. And that may be the way to pull in 1 Samuel 28, like I say, all of that, to pull all of that in. I've heard an explanation. I'm going to save it for 1 Samuel 20. Basically, it's the idea that mental illness was there. I have a little problem with that answer, but I've heard that. I've read that. It was proposed in a graduate class I took. Yeah, the teacher was a little anyway, but so I don't know, but like I say, I don't have a problem, even textually, saying that they might know, but to say they influence. And I know a few years ago, well, I think it's still going on. And if you believe this, I'm not trying to hurt your feelings, okay? But I see the pretty red birds that Kim's fixed us up with. That's a sign that that's your mama or your dead loved one, something showing up. So if you're driving down the road and there's a red bird that you see, that's your loved one showing up and trying to tell you something. Now, say if you believe that, okay. I don't. That may even be what Solomon is addressing in Ecclesiastes 9. I can't answer that, but that just is the answer that is about the only scripture I know of that answers the question. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, Hebrews 12. I personally think that goes back to the folks of Hebrews 11, all of those great folks of faith. I think that's who the cloud of witnesses are. But yes, it does say that. Anything else? All right, well, let's go to the next question. I'm just trying to answer two questions today. Will we recognize one another in the afterlife? I'm going to know in presenting both sides that I'm presenting it with a slant. And that slant is what I believe. And that is that we will recognize one another in the afterlife. And I'll show you some things. And like I say, you may not come to the same conclusion, because next week, one of the things that we want to look at is, are there degrees of punishment reward? And you get that inference, and that creates the problem, if you will. But will we recognize one another in heaven? Now, let me say this. You're not going to find a verse that just comes out and says you recognize one another. Like I say, that wasn't the reason for God revealing himself to explain all of this. But it does seem that passages would help us come to a conclusion. Let's look at the first side. First side is that we shall not recognize one another in heaven. What are some arguments that are used? What are some things that are said? First, it's said that we will have no memory. And we've already talked about that a little bit. We've already talked about the Revelation 6 and the Luke chapter 16 passage. They seem to point to the fact that, yeah, we do have memory in the afterlife. So, second, it said that since the body is changed at death, so is everything else, and will not recognize one another. One of the arguments that's been used by folks for years for this is the following. We recognize one another. We recognize one another by physical appearance, and thus we will not be able to tell one another, because we will not see each other as such. But we got to remember something. We got to remember a couple of things. Got to remember, first of all, we're going into a spiritual world. We're going from a physical world to a spiritual world. Now, we can apply it this way. I was looking at Facebook yesterday afternoon. I was sitting down for a few minutes, and I was looking at Facebook, and there was a guy that we went to college with. that popped up, and I was looking at his picture, and there is no way under the sun that if he were to walk in even now, that I would recognize him as the guy that we went to college with. Wouldn't recognize him at all. Todd Tunnell. Todd Tunnell, Todd Tunnell. I wouldn't recognize. I saw his picture, part of the Hardman boys. I wouldn't recognize him at all in comparison. We recognize one another from physical features. We recognize one another by virtue, folks say, well, you haven't changed a bit. Yeah, you look the same. Don't tell me that, because I have, 40 pounds heavier, and don't know how I gained 40 pounds and lost all my hair. How does that work? But anyway, my hair weighed 40 pounds. Headed more though. But this is what some would say. Well, it is interesting to think about the fact, though, in Luke chapter 24, verse 39, we've already studied this verse. Jesus was recognized when he was raised from the dead. And while people do change physically, there's still some identifying marks that individuals have. When you look at 1 Corinthians 15, and you look at verse 52 or verse 42 and verse 53, they show us that the spirit is not changed. It's just the body. It's just the physical body. And so you say, well, then that proves that we can't recognize. No, that doesn't prove, just proves that we've changed. Could say this, and some might say even this. Okay, preacher, let's give some assumptions here. We know that when we die, this mortal puts on immortality. 1 Corinthians 15. We know that the body returns to the dust of the earth. We know that the soul returns to God that gave it, Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 7. We got all that. We've got all that. We understand all of those principles because we've been studying them all along. And so we change to a spiritual body. And while we may not understand or may not recognize each other from the standpoint of at first sight, and let us use that word, if you will, we will know each other from then on. Now, there's a possibility, right? But in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 42, Paul makes this statement in talking about the resurrected body. He says, so also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption. It is raised incorruptible. And then he says in verse 53, verse that we're more familiar with, corruptible must put on incorruption. This mortal must put on immortality. So we know the passing of the body. We get that. But Job then helps us a little bit, because Job says in Job 19, by the way, go back. If you have time, if you have interest, go back and read the book of Job. It's a great book. Job basically is asking for the justice of God. And if you get to the end of the book, what you find out is God says, you've got it. You've got it. You've received it. Now, what some of Job's friends say in the middle there of the book, if you will, actually Job 5, they began answering. Some of the things they say are not correct. And Job tells them, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not right. So you got to be careful when you pull things out. But in Job chapter 19, verse 25, Job makes a statement. He says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand at last on the earth. And after my skin is destroyed, this I know, that in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another, how my heart yearns within me. For you would say, how we persecute him, since the root of the matter is found in him. Be afraid of the sword of yourselves, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword, that you may know there is a judgment. Notice what he says, the beginning of verse 25. Verse 26 especially. He says, I know that I'm going to see my Redeemer. How are you going to know him? Well, I'm going to be able to recognize him. Wait a minute, Job didn't see the Lord. That's right. So it could be, if you will, that once Job is introduced to the Lord, from then on he recognizes it. Could it be though, that we recognize one another immediately. It could be. But the Bible just simply seems to say, at least to me, that there's recognition. Others have objected to this idea of recognition by pointing to Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30. This is a verse that has given my wife great pause. At first, when we first got married, she asked me about this verse, and she was very upset. Now she rejoices over this verse. Notice what it says. There are some that are having trouble, and they're asking the Lord, and they're trying to trap the Lord. Verse 28 says, therefore in the resurrection, whose wife of the seven shall she be? Remember, it's the idea of, ladies married to a man, she dies, then the brother takes over that part of the old law. And so they're trying to trap Jesus, and they carry him through that scenario of brother dying and the next brother and the next brother taking. And so they're simply asking, well, in the afterlife, if you will, whose wife shall she be? And Jesus says in verse 29, he says, you're mistaken, not knowing the scriptures nor the power of God. He said, you don't know what you're talking about. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels of God in heaven. Now, well, let's go on. But concerning the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was spoken of God, saying, I am God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. There was a lack of knowledge that these folks had in setting up this scenario, and that's not what we're trying to study today. But notice that he says, with regards to the resurrection, there's neither marriage nor given in marriage. We're not going to need that physical relationship that we need here upon the earth. And so, in the afterlife, we're not going to be given to marriage. We're not going to need that interaction. We're not going to need the bond that brings us together as husband and wife. But notice that he says we are like. He doesn't say we are. We talked about angels back sometime this past year. Well, first of this past year, we talked about angels and what they are. And Nehemiah 9 verse 6 and other passages tell us that basically angels are created beings, created by God. Can be used by God, yes, as messengers. The word angelos is the idea of a messenger as well, translated a messenger. But notice what he says. He says they are like angels of God in heaven. They're not physical, they're spiritual. That's the point of the verse. They're spiritual. And so this verse does not deal with recognition, but more of the afterlife. Well, others object. Let's move on quickly. Others object to the fact that and say that we will not recognize one another in heaven by making an emotional appeal. And that fact is that we recognize one another and note the fact that certain loved ones will not be there, and that would mar the bliss of heaven. That's an appeal that's been made for a long time. Brother Wayne Jackson passed away last year. Some of his writings back in the early 2000s were interesting on this point. He makes the statement, first of all, he says that if I don't recognize one another in heaven, and I use that as saying, okay, I'm not going to recognize one another in heaven because I would be lost, I would be mad or sad, I would be upset at the very idea that here I've got loved ones that are not in heaven. Well, what about the flip side of that coin? And the fact that you think, well, here I am, and I don't know if my sister made it. I don't know if my mother made it. I don't know if my father made it. I don't know if my wife made it. I don't know if my children made it. And so his, if you will, using the emotional appeal, well, the bliss of heaven will be marred if I realize that some of my loved ones are not there. He flips the coin in his answer, Brother Jackson did, and says, well, what about this? What about the other side? that we just proposed. And then you get into thinking about, and you notice the fact that in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 11, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 25, it talks about God being happy. Let's look at these passages. They're all together. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 11. He says, according to the glorious gospel of blessed God, which is committed in my trust. He's talking about those things that are left out. But then he says, I think I've got the wrong passage. No, I do. I'll have to get these again. These are the wrong passages. But it talks about, and I didn't look at this. I didn't look those verses up. Let me get back with you on that. But there are two verses that talk about God eternally and talk about him from the standpoint of him being happy. And Brother Jackson, in his article that makes the statement, he says, how can God be happy in eternity with folks that have passed away that didn't make it to heaven? And the point being made then is that when you consider God's happiness, how can God be happy with the unrighteous having failed? Helps us to understand that there is a joy in heaven over what John talks about in Revelation chapter 21, in the presence of God, that would be there, that would so override the joy or the disappointment that we might feel when folks that we know and love didn't make it. There will be folks. I am not the judge, but what I'm going to say right now is going to sound very judgmental. There are folks that we all know and love dearly, that we know based upon what we have seen this side of eternity did not do what God said do. We've prayed for them, we've asked them, we've begged them to straighten up, and they haven't done it. Consequently, what the Bible, it doesn't look good for them. Doesn't mean we can't love them, doesn't mean we shouldn't love them, doesn't mean we shouldn't pray, shouldn't try, we should. But to tell me that God is going to take away my joy because those people that I loved were not there means to tell me that God can't do certain things. And one of those is he can't give me joy, an overriding joy. That's just an argument that's been used through the years. Something anybody want to say before we look at the other side right quickly, and we'll try to do it. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. I read that back some time ago. I thought that was a great line. That's a good point. Good point. That's the issue. I mean, I want my family to be there. I want my wife to be there. And I do believe I'll recognize her, and I want to recognize her. And pray for my children, my son, my daughter-in-law, my grandchild every day, as I know you do for yours. We do know that not everybody's going to be in heaven. Now, and my wife said this, and I'll give it to her. My wife said this a long time ago. She said, but if we get there and God opens the gates and says everybody can come in, I'm not going to be mad. I'm really not. Let me in. That's all I ask. Let me in. And I believe, because of what the Bible teaches and the way the Bible teaches, that I want to do what the Bible says, and I don't want to take my chances on the fact that the Lord's going to open the door wide and say, everybody come in. But that he's going to hold true. And to be honest, if you look at, like I say, I'm studying the justice and the righteousness of God. If you look at the justice and the righteousness of God, he can't and won't do that. Even though he is a gracious and merciful God, he still won't do that. He can't, because that would violate his very nature. Anything else? let's look at the other side. I do believe, as I said, I do believe that there's recognition. I do believe that there's memory on the other side of this life. I'm gonna leave you with the Genesis 25 verse 8 passage. This is Abraham was buried in Canaan. His ancestors were buried in a different land, but it says that he was gathered to his people. Folks have used this to say, well, he went to his folks, where they were in eternity. I think that while that can be translated or looked at from the standpoint of he knew those folks when he passed away, I also think that can be looked at a little bit differently. But this is one of the verses that a lot of folks use with regards to while they were in a different place, they were buried. He did not go to the same place from the standpoint of burial where his folks were, but in the eternity, he went to where his folks were. That's the way folks take that verse. And so that just simply means that they gathered together. That really doesn't teach us the idea of recognition and memory. It just teaches us that they went to the same place. But anyway, that's a verse that's used. Let's jump on down. There are I give you two examples of two men that were talking about their dead sons that show us that we'll be able to recognize one another. Jacob, thinking that his son was dead, said that he would go and join his son. Genesis 37 verse 25. David had a similar experience. Remember with Absalom or with the son that came about because of his relationship with Bathsheba in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 23. I shall not go to him, but he shall go to me. And some would object and say, well, that just simply says that the boy existed. Yeah. But notice that in both of these, there's an insight into this idea that they're going to be with folks that they know. And how do they know them unless they can recognize them? That's the argument that's used. Another is the joy that Paul seemed to experience and demonstrate. And I've given you several passages there. And because of time, we're not going to go over them. But I think we could come to an answer with regards to Paul's verses there. That Paul basically is saying that I remember them, and thus I would remember life. And not only would I remember life, but I remember what took place. And so as we looked at the second lesson of this series, or third lesson, of this series, we talked about the body, the spiritual body that the text tells us about. And we talked about Jesus and his spiritual body, and we talked about the limitations and the lack thereof limitations. And so we do know difference. We do know and understand differences. But when we look at Paul simply seemed to demonstrate, well, I'm going to know you. I'm going to know the brethren at Philippi. I'm going to know the brethren at Colossae. I'm going to know the brethren that I knew. I'm going to know them, and I'm going to be able to be with them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is another passage that's talking about the second coming of the Lord. There's hope, there's joy, there's anticipation. And I don't know about you. I am not, I don't want to say this again. I am not extremely, how do I want to say this? I don't get the warm fuzzies with people I've just first met. Now, after I've been around them for a little while and understand their nature and their sayings and things, I'm warm to them. But right at first, I just want to listen to them and see what they have to say and what they have to think and see what's going on in their life. But you think about, well, okay, we're going to recognize, yes. Well, how at first? Maybe it's an introduction. Who knows? Scriptures don't tell us. And so we have to say, well, how do we warm up to them? Well, once again, we're talking in physical terms about a spiritual afterlife. Then Luke 16 is used. We studied that in depth last week. I'll not go over it again, but it does seem as if both the rich man and Lazarus, they had recognition, they remembered, and they remembered what was going on, especially Lazarus. Remember what was going on with his brothers. Remember he asked that the rich man asked Lazarus to go back to his brothers. And so God said, no, that's not going to happen. It seems to be, and I've had to fly through the, what I believe, side of this argument, but it seems to me if there's no memory in the hereafter, then one would not know what they're there for and why they are where they are. And so think about it. If hell is punishment, and scriptures say that it is, if heaven's reward, and the scriptures say that it is, and we don't have memory of what took place here upon the earth, and we don't have recognition of where we are or who we're with, short of being told all of that, which you might say, well, preacher, that's a possibility, and it is. Short of being told all that, then we would sit there in eternity in heaven and wonder, why are we here and what are we doing here? And who are all these folks? These are two questions that I get asked. I've 39 years of preaching. I've been asked several times these questions. This is the best I think Scripture has to offer with regards to an answer to these questions. Does it answer these questions? Does it answer it to your satisfaction? Maybe not. As I've said before, just let me in, Lord. Let me do what I can to the best of my ability. Let me do what you want me to do. But in the end, Lord, be gracious to me and welcome me in. That's all I ask, and that's all I can expect. And if the afterlife is nothing like what we've seemed to come to the conclusion of, then okay, it's not. We'll learn to deal with it then. We're going to, like I say, I've got another set of questions that folks have asked me through the years. We'll answer those, and then we'll probably take another lesson. So we'll probably do 2 more weeks. The second lesson is more positive. I know we don't like to think of death from a positive standpoint, but if you stop and think about how the Bible portrays death, it's positive. I'm in a strait betwixt two, Paul said, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain here in the flesh is more needful of you. Paul said, I have a desire to die. Now, that's not to say we're not going to get into euthanasia. We're not going to get into suicide. We're not going to get into those things. Those are different issues. But it is to say that while we dread death this side of eternity, we call it, Job 18:14, we call it the king of terrors. It is to say that it's not all bad. Anything else anybody like to say? Well, hopefully it'll get you to maybe looking a little deeper and studying a little deeper, and I'll try to think to get that passage that I messed up on, get it right, find it, see what I was talking about, see what I was trying to talk about. Anything else? Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're thankful for this day, for the blessing of it, thankful for the opportunity to study your word. And while many of the questions that we have maybe are not directly answered through your word, we do understand that there is an afterlife. We do understand that there is an eternity that we can spend with you. Help us to live our life in such a way that we can hear the words, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the gates prepared for you. Be with us now, watch over us, bless us, be with those of our number that have not been with us in the last 2-3 weeks, and help us to see what's going on with them, but be with them and bless them as well. Watch over us and hold us as we hold to you, for this is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. Y'all have a great week. Thank y'all.